The moment I saw it, the papers, the signature, the notarized betrayal, I felt my chest crack in half. Mom had taken everything. Every single thing I thought was mine. My father's house, my savings, even the small cafe I had built from scratch. Everything gone. She smiled while signing, like she'd just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. My name is Avery Collins. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been treated like a stranger in your own family? Like your own blood is just a polite inconvenience? I remember the cold taste of coffee in my mouth that morning. I sipped, watching her fingers move over the pen, a snake coiling around my future. My brother Nathan leaned against the counter, scrolling on his phone, completely indifferent. He didn't look up. He didn't even blink. It was like my destruction was background noise to him, a minor annoyance. I wanted to scream, to rip the papers from her hands. But I didn't. I swallowed the rage, the shock, the humiliation. I let it sit like a stone in my stomach. Mom looked at me, eyes glinting with triumph. "You've always been too soft, Avery," she said. The words burned into me like acid. Soft people get nothing. And in that moment I realized softness doesn't save you. Strength is never given, it's taken. And if I didn't take it, my life would be over before it even began. I walked out of that kitchen, my heels clicking on the hardwood, each step a vow. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But I knew the fire inside me had just ignited. The kind of fire that doesn't stop until it consumes everything in its path. Outside, the city was buzzing, indifferent to my heartbreak. Cars honked. People laughed. Somewhere a dog barked. Life didn't pause for betrayal. I clenched my fist. Every dollar they stole from me would be returned. Every humiliation they poured on me would be repaid. And I wouldn't just take it back. I would make them watch me rise while they crumbled. By the time I got to my apartment, the rage had settled into a cold, sharp clarity. Plans whispered themselves into my mind. I would not confront them yet, not today. Today was about gathering pieces, watching their weaknesses, finding the cracks in the armor they thought was impenetrable. I stared at the blank walls, at the empty space where my dreams had once lived. And I whispered to myself, they think they've won. But the game hasn't even started. I made a promise. Not just to myself but to the version of me they tried to bury. That version wouldn't just survive. She would thrive. And she would do it on her own terms. Because sometimes, the only justice that matters is the one you take. And in the silence of that apartment, with the city humming outside, I realized something terrifyingly beautiful. I was no longer the girl who bent under their hands. I was someone new. Someone unstoppable. Someone who would make them wish they'd never been born. And they would pay that I didn't take revenge that day. I disappeared into plain sight. Not a vanishing act, just a careful evaporation of trust. I folded myself into the city's rhythm and watched them like a pulse. Part 1 was the scream, Part 2 was the methodical breath that follows. I opened a burner account, rented a mailbox, and learned to speak in data. Money moves leave footprints. Footprints make maps. I traced transfers to Mom's lawyers and Nathan's investments until Project Hartwell, my father's house under a legal alias, glowed like a red pin. I listened. I watched. Routines reveal weak points. At a cafe near the firm, I befriended a paralegal named Casey. He complained about overtime and casually mentioned Anna Morales, the woman who notarized Hartwell. Anna was a small, sharp map into a larger terrain. They thought paper was a moat. They were wrong. I stitched their errors into a plan. Nathan carried a hidden credit line with a partner named Alvarez. Payments labeled consulting funneled to an offshore shell. I subpoenaed records, skimmed forums, and paid a kid to pull archived pages. Each finding was a stone for the pile I intended to bury them with. Intelligence without leverage is theater. So I bought leverage with patience and daring. I slipped a flash drive into Nathan's gym locker. One transaction tying Alvarez to that offshore account, and a note. Friends keep receipts. He found it, jaw tight, eyes calculating. For the first time he looked unnerved. Mistakes multiplied after that. Mom spoke in rehearsed sentences. Nathan's smirk cracked. An accidental curse at dinner. A message deleted too quickly. They flinched at envelopes, at calls from numbers they didn't recognize. Watching them shrink was a peculiar cruelty. A firm party gave me Anna's face. Casey invited me because I listened. I went as someone ordinary and left with a detail. Anna laughed too loudly and avoided mentioning why she notarized that file. Small things sound like nothing until they become a chorus. I started planting seeds. An anonymous tip to a local reporter who hated the rich. An envelope slipped to a former partner burned by Alvarez. Tiny combustions that made them look over their shoulders. I slept less but with clearer purpose. The fire I wanted changed. No longer an impulsive blaze of rage, but a slow, inevitable burn that eats rotten wood. My life narrowed to one focus: reclaim what was taken. One night I sat in my car outside their house and watched Mom through the window, smiling at a man who wasn't my father. It felt like watching a play where the set belongs to you and the actors steal the lines. I drove away smiling too because I had learned to wait. Revenge, I decided, would not be sudden. It would be inevitable. They would feel every inch of my absence. I stopped stealing shadows and started making them. If part 2 was the map, part 3 was the ambush. Slow, surgical, and impossible to ignore. I bought an office for a week. A rented desk with a fake LLC name, Riverside Advisory, and a receptionist who believed in plausibility. I rented a suit I could afford only because I'd started selling off things they'd never notice. People do what they're shown. Nathan showed up because a potential investor named Caleb Rivers had requested a pitch. Caleb didn't exist. I did. He came with his usual arrogance, a new haircut, a cologne that screamed entitlement. He brought Alvarez, thin, sweating, the kind of man who counts risk like it's a sport. They laughed about margins and shell companies and how paperwork was merely ceremonial. I smiled and listened. I let them think this meeting was a win for them. I let them speak in the language of thieves. A recorder hid in my pen. Cameras watched the doorway. Casey slipped in as a junior associate and played the eager intern. They were sloppy with their secrets, too comfortable. Alvarez explained how offshore accounts moved money under consulting and creative fees. Nathan joked about notarizing with Anna because she was discreet. They said the word discreet like it absolved them. I let them finish. Then I closed my laptop, thanked them, and watched them leave with the unworried swagger of men who believe themselves untouchable. Outside, I compiled the file. Receipts, voice clips, routing numbers, the casual cruelty of their laughter. I sent the package to 3 places. A local investigative reporter hungry for a scandal, a regional prosecutor who liked high-profile fraud, and an email address I'd created that belonged to a financial compliance firm. The dominoes didn't know they were aligned. By the next morning, Nathan's phone screamed with text he couldn't answer. Alvarez stopped returning calls. Mom sent a text with a string of heart emojis and a question mark. Something trivial that used to mean comfort. The newsroom called. The prosecutor's office requested an interview. I watched their world tilt. They tried to spin. Mom was graceful in public. Prayers, smiles, statements about misunderstanding. Nathan posted photos of himself at a charity gala, teeth gleaming as if a camera flash could blight the past. But paper leaves traces. People who launder money are often the same people who forget to delete metadata. Their arrogance had become my trail. I watched one of their strongest allies back away. A board member quietly resigned. A bank froze a transfer. It felt almost clinical, like pressing a button and watching a machine fail. For the first time since the papers were signed, I saw them small. I felt a vindictive elation, a bird-song of satisfaction I'd never let myself admit. They were not invincible. But victory is a strange mirror. When the first news segment aired, my name never mentioned, my role invisible. Mom watched it in our old living room on a tablet, shoulders trembling in a way I'd never seen. Her lipstick blurred into mascara as she tried to steady her voice for the camera. She looked older in that feed, the kind of older trouble stamps on a face when choices pile up like unpaid bills. Nathan sat beside her but didn't touch her. His jaw wore the practiced blankness of denial. I sat in my car across the street, breath fogging the window, and for a moment I saw a version of myself reflected back. Hardened, yes, but hollower too. The hurt I'd nursed had begun to shape me. Their fall had started, but so had a new loneliness that threading revenge on spools. I realized then that breaking them might not fill the space they left behind. It might simply echo the fracture they'd given me. And for the first time, the thought of them crumbling sounded less like triumph and more like an answer I wasn't sure I wanted. I turned the key in the ignition and in that brief metallic hum, heard the truth. Vengeance can win battles, but it doesn't always win hearts. They called it escalation like it was a game. I called it survival. When the subpoenas turned into threats, cease and desist letters with law firm letterheads and men in navy suits at my door, things stopped being about proofs and started being about who could make the other flinch first. Nathan hired a PI with a face like a dock worker, Perkins, who watched my apartment from across the street and took pictures of me buying groceries, of me at the laundromat, of a woman who'd forgotten how small privacy used to feel. Perkins handed the photos to his client and left a card on my car with a smile that meant nothing. He thought fear would make me fold. Instead it made me sharpen. I changed routes. I paid cash. I met Casey in alleys and fed him files and coffee sleeves. I moved funds into accounts only I knew, tiny transfers that would keep me breathing. Every dollar I spent was a vote for the life I refused to lose. I was no longer the woman who'd built a cafe. Now I ran a network of carefully placed truths. They attacked where I lived. My reputation. A smear piece. Anonymous, vicious. Claimed I'd forged signatures, accused me of fraud. Comments flooded my old cafe's reviews online. Someone flooding stars and lies until the truth looked like a rumor. Mom called my sister on FaceTime and left a voicemail in the middle of the night. Avery's unstable. Don't trust her. The bite of those words was clean and precise. I answered in the only way that made sense. I went public but not with anger. I went public with precision. I released the conversation recordings I'd collected, the ones where Alvarez laughed about creative fees, and Anna admitted she'd been paid to look the other way. I leaked bank trails to the compliance firm I'd baited. I sat for an interview, voice steady, eyes open. I told what I had, not what I felt, because feelings are luxury and evidence is currency. They retaliated physically. My car was keyed one night, long angry scratches along the driver's side, and a note tucked under the wiper. Stay buried. I ran my thumb across the damage like it was a line on my palm I hadn't read before. Threats used to be whispers. Now they were scratches on metal and men who followed me until I ducked into crowded stores. But the thing about fire is it reveals. The more they tried to torch my name, the brighter the truth burned for others. A former accountant for Alvarez came forward, white as paper, hands trembling. A neighbor testified that Anna had been seen leaving the notary office with a folder stamped Hartwell the week before the signature. Small witnesses became an accumulation that looked like a wall. The prosecutor's office called. They wanted to talk about indictments. My heart thudded so loud my teeth rattled. For the first time since the papers were signed, hope wasn't just a sharp edge. It was a possible thing. The scale finally tilted. But victory asked for a price. In the affidavit I signed, I needed to mention family. In court transcripts, my mother's name would be read aloud, tied to my claim. Nathan's face would be entered into public record, subject to cross-examination. The legal machine doesn't separate love from liability. It eats both. I drove to the old house the night before I filed my statement. The lights were on. Mom was at the window, small and lit like a portrait. I stood on the sidewalk and listened to her laugh, a sound I used to know, through the glass. For a second I wanted to retreat, to take the easy exit that would save the family name. But the tiled roof, the porch lights, the photographs framed in the hallway, all of it had been signed away with her pen. The house hummed with an emptiness that had once been mine. I pressed my palm to the cool glass and felt a memory I couldn't name. Justice sat in my lap like a newborn, demanding, heavy, alive. I could walk away now and leave them to whatever small piece they'd voted for, or I could press forward and drag the truth into the light, consequences and all. When I walked back to my car, the city was quiet, and for the first time the silence felt like an answer rather than a threat. I breathed in, exhaled anger, and let the calm settle like armor. Because sometimes the last thing you love is the thing that hurt you most, and you have to decide if saving it is worth watching it burn. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and old money. I could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment, every chair that scraped against marble. Part 4 was the build-up. Part 5 was the stage. I stepped into it knowing they thought this would break me. They were wrong. Mom sat at the front, perfect posture, pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights. Nathan's tie was crooked and he was chewing his nails like a kid caught stealing. They had rehearsed their composure. But rehearsed doesn't fool truth. Not when the truth walks in, wearing the patience of months, the precision of evidence, and the kind of calm that whispers, "I see everything." I signed in, my hands steady, my breath a metronome. Every document I carried was a dagger disguised as paper. Checks, transfers, notarized lies, all meticulously collated. The moment the clerk called my case, I felt the room tilt toward me. All the power, all the pride, all the smiles that had been painted on Mom's face. It didn't matter. My name carried more weight than their years of privilege. "Miss Collins," the judge said, voice even, eyes sharp behind glasses. "Are you ready to proceed?" I nodded, heart steady. Not because I wasn't terrified, but because fear had been the forge that shaped this version of me. Fear was mine now to wield. Mom's smile flickered. Nathan looked bored. That was their mistake. They'd underestimated how meticulous obsession could become. I began my testimony, not with tears, not with rage, but with facts. Every number, every transfer, every conversation I delivered like bullets. I watched the subtle twitch in Alvarez's jaw as my recordings played. I felt the courtroom shift with each piece of undeniable proof. The prosecutor leaned forward, eyes bright. "Is there anything further you'd like to add?" I held my gaze on Mom. Her lips pressed thin. "Yes," I said. "I'd like you to remember this. Every action has a witness, every choice leaves a mark, and every betrayal carries a cost." Nathan's smirk dissolved, replaced by a flicker of panic. He was no longer untouchable. Mom's hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled. The pearls rattled against each other. A sound small and innocent and yet somehow catastrophic. Outside, the press waited. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment the truth became undeniable. I didn't need to speak to them. The courtroom had already told the story. My rise, their fall, the months of careful precision, all distilled in this single cinematic hour. By the time I left, the chill of autumn had crept into the city streets. I walked past the courthouse steps and let the wind sweep over me, carrying away the residue of fear and shame I'd carried for years. I felt lighter, but something deeper had shifted. Victory is not a quiet thing. It echoes and it hums inside you in a way that can't be ignored. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, alone but whole. I poured a glass of wine, the color deep and red, and watched the skyline like a witness. In that moment, I realized the fight had changed me. I was no longer the girl who bent under their hands. I was someone sharper, harder, and far more dangerous. And yet, in the quiet, I admitted something to myself. Triumph tastes bittersweet. The people you love, or thought you did, can betray you so deeply that reclaiming your life comes at the cost of reclaiming your heart. But as I raised my glass, the city lights reflecting in the deep red liquid, I smiled. Because revenge is not just about payback. It's about reclaiming yourself even if the world thinks you've lost. And I hadn't lost. Not yet. They said the hardest part would be living after the verdict. They were wrong. The hardest part was living while everyone else watched you make them pay. Part 6 is the unspooling. What comes when the walls you tore down start to collapse inward, and the sound of their panic becomes your new soundtrack. The indictments hit like an army. Nathan's accounts were frozen. Alvarez was in federal custody, and Ana Morales, small, sharp Anna, was subpoenaed and trembling on a witness stand where she'd once stamped lies with a practiced hand. Mom's name lived now in court filings and news crawls. Her smile on the morning shows had hardened into something brittle, the lacquer cracking under heat. Every headline was a pinprick into the life she'd tried to build on theft. But the world has a smell for weakness, and predators gather. Their friends scattered quickly, donations returned, calls unanswered, but the vultures circled in other ways. People I didn't expect reached out. An old supplier I'd helped years ago, a barista from my cafe who slipped me a quiet "you did it" when no one was watching. Gratitude came in small human forms. It was a reminder that I hadn't fought this alone, even if most of the fight had been solitary. Money matters resurfaced. Legal fees, investigators, the litany of costs that justice demands. I watched our accounts, once fat with the illusion of permanence, become arithmetic. $12,000 here for forensic accounting, $8,500 there for travel, Another $15,000 for compliance filings. I had saved scraps. I had moved funds into safe pockets. Every transaction felt like a small victory, a tax on my rage that I gladly paid to keep the momentum. They fought back dirty. Anonymous packages arrived at my door. No threats, just reminders that I was not safe. A photograph of my apartment key taped to a page. A Polaroid of me at the courthouse framed by someone whose face I'd never seen. They tried to scratch away the proof of my life. But each attempt only confirmed what I already knew. Fear was their primary currency. Then came the betrayal I hadn't expected. Casey, my paralegal ally, the conduit who'd slipped me lunchroom gossip and scrawled notes, called one night. His voice was thin, a tremor I recognized too well. He'd been subpoenaed and offered a deal. Testify for leniency or take the fall for obstruction. I had taught him how the game worked. I had never meant for him to be a casualty. We met on a bridge that smelled of river and diesel, the city lights glinting behind him like distant stars. He looked smaller than I remembered, guilt folding his shoulders in. They gave me a choice, he whispered. I can keep my record clean, Avery. I can keep my future. His eyes searched mine for absolution I couldn't give. I wanted to scream at him for being human, for choosing his life over our cause. Instead, I reached into my bag and handed him an envelope. Cash, enough to cover a rent and a fresh start. Go, I said. Start somewhere no one knows you. He clutched the envelope like it was a lifeline and left, shoulders shaking. Watching him go felt like handing a life preserver to someone who would never swim back. That night, alone, I counted the cost of winning. There were people in the periphery whose lives had become collateral. Friends, allies, small kindnesses that had nothing to do with my war. The reality settled like ash. Justice bends but does not warp fate. Some casualties are unavoidable. Still, the indictments mounted. Nathan was arraigned. Alvarez sat in orange behind glass with eyes that had lost their arrogance. Mom hired the best defense money can buy, and yet her face in the courtroom photos looked like a museum piece. Beautiful, admired, but forever behind glass. I found a strange comfort in watching them reduced to paperwork and protocol. It was clinical, almost surgical, and it soothed the part of me that preferred order over chaos. But the human cost, Casey's shaking hands, the barista's silence, cut through the calm like a blade. Late that week, as rain pelted the city and blurred the neon into smeared watercolor, I walked past my old cafe. The sign still hung crooked, the shadow of what I'd built. A young woman inside looked up and smiled when she saw me, a smile of pure, unfiltered recognition. It was then I understood. The world would keep turning, people would keep living, and some wounds They said would the become hardest something part would other be than living pain. after the verdict. Calluses, they were perhaps wrong, stitched over the by hardest time. part was living while and in everyone that else rain-washed watched you moment, make them pay. I realized Part the truth 6 I'd is the been avoiding. unspooling. The war What comes I'd when the waged walls for you my tore life down had become become a a life life of of its inward. own. And the sound of their panic becomes your new I hadn't
soundtrack.
signed up for.
The indictments
The
hit like an
scoreboard
army.
was changing, but
Nathan's
the tally
accounts
was
were
not
frozen.
simple. Alvarez
Victory
was in
would
federal
come with a
custody,
ledger
and
I might
Anna
never be
Morales,
able to balance.
small, sharp
I
Anna,
lifted my
was
face to the
subpoenaed
rain
and
and
trembling
let it
on a
wash the
witness
courtroom
stand
off
where
my
she'd once
skin.
stamped lies
The
with a
water
practiced
tasted like
hand.
iron and
Mom's
relief.
name lived now in court filings and news crawls. Her smile on the morning shows had hardened into something brittle, the lacquer cracking under heat. Every headline was a pinprick into the life she'd tried to build on theft. But the world has a smell for weakness, and predators gather. Their friends scattered quickly, donations returned, calls unanswered, but the vultures circled in other ways. People I didn't expect reached out. An old supplier I'd helped years ago, a barista from my cafe who slipped me a quiet "you did it" when no one was watching. Gratitude came in small human forms. It was a reminder that I hadn't fought this alone, even if most of the fight had been solitary. Money matters resurfaced. Legal fees, investigators, the litany of costs that justice demands. I watched our accounts, once fat with the illusion of permanence, become arithmetic. $12,000 here for forensic accounting, $8,500 there for travel, another $15,000 for compliance filings. I had saved scraps. I had moved funds into safe pockets. Every transaction felt like a small victory, a tax on my rage that I gladly paid to keep the momentum. They fought back dirty. Anonymous packages arrived at my door. No threats, just reminders that I was not safe. A photograph of my apartment key taped to a page, a Polaroid of me at the courthouse framed by someone whose face I'd never seen. They tried to scratch away the proof of my life. But each attempt only confirmed what I already knew. Fear was their primary currency. Then came the betrayal I hadn't expected. Casey, my paralegal ally, the conduit who'd slipped me lunchroom gossip and scrawled notes, called one night. His voice was thin, a tremor I recognized too well. He'd been subpoenaed and offered a deal: testify for leniency or take the fall for obstruction. I had taught him how the game worked. I had never meant for him to be a casualty. We met on a bridge that smelled of river and diesel, the city lights glinting behind him like distant stars. He looked smaller than I remembered, guilt folding his shoulders in. They gave me a choice, he whispered. I can keep my record clean, Avery. I can keep my future. His eyes searched mine for absolution I couldn't give. I wanted to scream at him for being human, for choosing his life over our cause. Instead, I reached into my bag and handed him an envelope. Cash, enough to cover a rent and a fresh start. Go, I said. Start somewhere no one knows you. He clutched the envelope like it was a lifeline and left, shoulders shaking. Watching him go felt like handing a life preserver to someone who would never swim back. That night, alone, I counted the cost of winning. There were people in the periphery whose lives had become collateral. Friends, allies, small kindnesses that had nothing to do with my war. The reality settled like ash. Justice bends but does not warp fate. Some casualties are unavoidable. Still, the indictments mounted. Nathan was arraigned. Alvarez sat in orange behind glass with eyes that had lost their arrogance. Mom hired the best defense money can buy, and yet her face in the courtroom photos looked like a museum piece. Beautiful, admired, but forever behind glass. I found a strange comfort in watching them reduced to paperwork and protocol. It was clinical, almost surgical, and it soothed the part of me that preferred order over chaos. But the human cost, Casey's shaking hands, the barista's silence, cut through the calm like a blade. Late that week, as rain pelted the city and blurred the neon into smeared watercolor, I walked past my old cafe. The sign still hung crooked, the shadow of what I'd built. A young woman inside looked up and smiled when she saw me, a smile of pure, unfiltered recognition. It was then I understood. The world would keep turning, people would keep living, and some wounds would become something other than pain. Calluses perhaps stitched over by time. And in that rain-washed moment, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. The war I'd waged for my life had become a life of its own. It demanded sacrifices I hadn't signed up for. The scoreboard was changing, but the tally was not simple. Victory would come with a ledger I might never be able to balance. I lifted my face to the rain and let it wash the courtroom off my skin. The water tasted like iron and relief. The air in the city had shifted. Part 6 was chaos. Part 7 was reckoning. The truth I'd unleashed had begun to devour their carefully constructed lives, and I could finally watch the cracks widen from close range. Nathan was the first to fall apart. I saw him on the courthouse steps, the cameras capturing every tremor in his hands. He fumbled with his phone, trying to text someone, anyone, to fix what was already broken. His offshore accounts had been frozen, investors pulled out, and partners had quietly disappeared. I remembered his arrogance, the way he had laughed at me in the kitchen years ago, the way he had shrugged at Mom's cruelty as if it weren't his own. And now he looked small, ridiculous, like a child caught with his hand in a jar of cookies he thought no one was watching. Mom was next. She had always believed that her charm could ward off reality. It didn't. Reporters hounded her, lawyers questioned her, and old friends refused to return calls. Her smile, once perfect and polished, had fractured. I caught a glimpse of her through the courthouse window, lipstick smudged, pearls gone, shoulders slumped. She looked lost in a life she had thought she controlled, and the sight made a small, dark part of me rejoice. I didn't gloat, not openly. I had learned long ago that satisfaction tastes bitter when it's shouted. Instead, I orchestrated the final phase. Every transaction, every call, Every shred of evidence I'd painstakingly gathered became a symphony of inevitability. Nathan's partners received anonymous tips, leading to audits. Mom's publicist leaked internal emails to journalists. Alvarez's plea bargain meant he was forced to testify, his testimony sealing the financial labyrinth they tried to hide behind. I sat in the courtroom quietly, letting each moment wash over me. The sound of the judge reading indictments, the clatter of papers, the shocked gasps in the gallery, all of it was a soundtrack to my patience, to my years of meticulous preparation. Every snide remark, every betrayal, every ounce of disdain they'd shown me was now laid bare for the world to see. And yet there was a hollow ache inside me. Revenge, I realized, is a violent teacher. It doesn't just punish, it reshapes the soul. I had clawed my way to the top of their ruin, but the climb had left me raw, alone, and oddly vulnerable. I remembered Casey, the barista, the quiet gestures of people I'd never expected to matter. My victories were spectacular, but my cost was measured in human fragments I could never fully gather back. When the final ruling came, it was decisive. Nathan and Alvarez were sentenced. Mom faced civil consequences that stripped her of every asset she had fought so hard to control. The courtroom erupted in whispers, flashbulbs, and muted tears, mine included. Not of relief, but of recognition. Justice was never simple and triumph never painless. Later that night I walked the city streets alone, the lights reflecting in puddles like fractured glass. I thought of the lives I'd dismantled and the one I'd rebuilt. My reflection in the wet asphalt stared back, hard eyes, tense jaw, fire still smoldering beneath the surface. I had survived the betrayal, navigated the chaos, and exacted justice, but I was no longer the same woman who had walked into that kitchen months ago. I lifted my face to the neon glow, let the cold wind bite, and whispered to the shadows, I am here. I am unbroken. I am relentless. And somewhere in the dark, the city seemed to acknowledge it. The streets were quieter now, the chaos of their world settling, and for the first time, I felt the strange, weighty taste of closure beginning to form. The game was almost over. Only one act remained. Mom was there, pearls in place, but the polish had worn off. She smiled faintly at me, the kind of smile that tries to mask defeat, but I could see through it. Nathan slouched beside her, tie crooked, eyes avoiding mine. They thought I'd lost. That I would break under the weight of paperwork, public scrutiny, and the echoes of family betrayal. They had no idea. I took the stand with a calm I had earned through months of obsession, strategy, and patience. Every file, every recording, every proof I had painstakingly collected was ready, not just to win, but to humiliate the arrogance that had once crushed me. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I spoke in measured tones, letting their own words and actions construct the gallows around them. I reminded the court of the transfers, the offshore accounts, the notarized lies. Alvarez's testimony tied it all together, Nathan's flustered denials crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. And Mom, my mother who had smiled at my destruction, stood exposed. Every statement, every action, every betrayal was laid bare. And then I paused. I looked at them. This isn't just about money, I said softly but firmly. This is about respect. About boundaries. About consequences for the choices you make when you think no one is watching. You believed I was soft. You believed I was naive. But you were wrong. You always were. The courtroom was still. The air vibrated with the tension of shattered egos. I could see Mom's lips quiver, Nathan's hands clench, Alvarez's jaw tighten. Their world had been meticulously constructed, but it had been built on sand. And now the tide had come. Outside the press waited. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled. Social media lit up with their downfall. And in that chaos I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction, not in cruelty but in truth. Justice wasn't just served. It was inevitable. I walked out, the city lights painting the streets gold and silver. I didn't need anyone to cheer. I didn't need applause. I had what mattered most. My life reclaimed, my dignity intact, my future mine to define. As I reached the courthouse steps I paused. For a moment I allowed myself to feel the weight of every year, every betrayal, every sleepless night. And then I let it go. Because the woman who had been hurt, humiliated, and betrayed no longer existed. In her place was someone sharper, stronger, and free. Mom, Nathan, Alvarez, they would rebuild their lives or they would not. That was no longer my concern. The world had shifted and I had moved with it. I had taken what was mine, but I had also taken something more important. Control. I turned away from the courthouse, the night air brushing against my face, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, the city felt like mine. Every step was deliberate, every breath a declaration. I had survived, I had fought, and I had won. And as the neon lights flickered across wet asphalt, I whispered to myself softly but undeniably,